Good afternoon, and welcome to this special panel discussion and session. My name is Valmont Lane. I work as a researcher at the Center for Humanities Research at the University of the Western Cape. The panel is called Beyond Nostalgia, Reimagining Post-Apartheid Freedom, and the topic of discussion is the documentary film by Premesh Lalu, titled The Double Futures of Athlone. We have an illustrious panel with us today. Premesh Lalu, of course, being the director, is the founding director of the Center for Humanities Research at the University of the Western Cape and professor of history at the Africa Institute in Sharjah. His book, Undoing Apartheid, on which his film is based, is due to be published in November 2022 by Polity Press. We also have Rashid Lombard, who probably needs no introduction. He has had an illustrious career as an activist, photographer, and of course an entrepreneur, producer who's made his mark, notably but not only, with the Cape Town International Jazz Festival. An enormous legacy that is still unfolding. Welcome, Rashid, and we are very pleased to have you here. Jason J. King, who's in the film, started out as a promoter in his early teens and was the pioneer of jazz and contemporary music production in South Africa. But then under the apartheid laws, he was forbidden to apply his skills in white South Africa, which placed him in with the disenfranchised people of South Africa. And of course, we will hear and speak, reflect a little bit with Jason in the next few minutes. We are waiting for one of our illustrious artists and personalities in Cape Town, Mama Kaap, Sylvia Ndun-Yelwa, will join us as soon as she can. And we are looking forward to having her in the room. Also a character in the film who has much to share with us about the life and times of the city of Cape Town and the place where she lived. Finally, I want to welcome Dinga Sikwebu. I know Dinga as a trade unionist, as a writer, and particularly as a cultural activist who has been very active in promoting, activating, and advocating public education about jazz in South Africa. He's an avid listener and one with tremendous insight into the industry and to the history of the music in South Africa. So welcome, everybody. This is a special film. It is, and I will come back to Premesh in a few minutes to ask him a little bit about where the journey with the film, where it came from. But before we do that, perhaps to start with Jason, in the film, if you've seen the film, you will reflect on the tremendous difficulties that people who were trying to start something, who were entrepreneurial in that sense, and activists, in trying to produce something inspired by the cinema and in a sense participating in the kind of production of the imagination in the cinema. I wondered, Jason, if you could talk a little bit about the experience of just thinking back on your career in the film and what that meant for you.
All right, great stuff. Well, hello, Daryl, and all the listeners out there, and as well as all the panelists, Rashid Lombard and Sylvia joining shortly. Yes, my stronghold of interest in the music industry came about in the early 60s. To be exact, 1960, that's when I started. And my formal base of promotional material and promotional acts came onto the stage at the Kismet Cinema in Athlone, which belonged to the Patel brothers and Patel family. And I started my career at Great Challenge at the Kismet during 1963, when I was a very young, astute promoter trying to put music productions on stage. I was over-ambitious by bringing together a show by American singer Trini Lopez that did the popular song La Bamba. And Trini Lopez was a Mexican that applied his musical career in the United States. I bought a share of the show in 1963 to come to the Kismet through a local promoter in Johannesburg. and Yango John was his name. And I went to Radio Good Hope and said to them, listen, I've got a show. It's a white artist show, and I need to present it on the Kismet stage. I had to apply for a permit through the Community Development Corporation to allow a white person to perform in front of a colored audience at the Kismet. Now, the Kismet was a 1,300-seater venue. It was one of the biggest venues to use during the early 60s, especially on the Cape Flats. Having brought the attention of the application to the authorities of the community development at the Thomas Boudel building in Barrack Street in Cape Town, it was approved, but through great difficulty and great embarrassment to me. They treated me as an Indian little boy trying to do white man's music or trying to do white man's business. And I was pushed from, I'm gone now. I think you're gone, Belmont. You've gone off the screen.
I'm still here.
Oh, okay, right, okay. There was a break in communication. So they were pushing me from pillar to post, but eventually the permit was approved. And I went to my friend Henny Peterson, who was the head of music at Radio Good Hope, and encouraged him to sell tickets in advance on the radio station, which they did. Tickets was very expensive those days. An international show ticket cost only 8 Rand. That sounds like a pittance today, but during the 60s, that was a lot of money. And once the show was advertised on Radio Good Hope, every single ticket was sold out for the show 3 weeks ahead of time. The bigger challenge came the evening of the show when Trini finished his program at the Alhambra Cinema in the heart of Cape Town, in the CBD area. He was then to be whisked away from the Alhambra to the Kismet Cinema in Athlone. But we had to stop that move from the Alhambra to Athlone because at 10:30 that evening, members of the South African police came along and presented me with a prohibition order saying that the permit has been revoked with no apparent reason. And we had 1,300 people standing in the queue from 9 o'clock in the evening already. The show was scheduled to start at midnight. So you can imagine, the viewers out there can imagine what a challenging moment this was. Great money was spent at the great extent of energy. And we had to refund every single person. 1,300 tickets were sold. We had to refund that. And the police was very arrogant because they were the guys in charge. And so the show was canceled. And that was my first obstacle in 1963.
And thank you for that story, because it places us in 1963 in the sort of early days of what was the kind of the moment in apartheid when everything seemed to be especially bleak. When there's the experience of exile, and there's the horrible despair that persons like yourself must have felt in having to deal with the imposition of these laws and regulations. I want to go to Premesh, because Premesh, this film has a particular trajectory and journey. You set out, as it says in the blurb for this discussion, to think about the cultural politics of the cinema, particularly in this era. What is the question that you're trying to pose with the film? And say a little bit about the journey of this film to this particular moment, from your perspective as somebody located inside the academy.
Thank you, Belmont. I'd like to hear from the others as well, so I'm going to keep this brief because there is a longer answer, and part of it is tied into the book project that you mentioned when we began. I was thinking as I was preparing for this session about what meditation this film is engaged in, and I was thinking about a song by Robbie Jansen. If you remember, he had a song called "Freedom, Where Have You Been?" And the second line was, "I've been looking all over." I won't try and... Yes, that's right. And in a sense, as I was thinking through this film and interviewing JJ and working with Sylvia, who's joined us now, and Itumeleng and a whole range of other people, it's quite clear that I think we've been looking in the wrong places for freedom in South Africa. And I think that, actually there was a space in the midst of apartheid, in the midst of the dread of apartheid, where a certain kind of cultural reimagining was beginning to take hold. And a place like Athlone had a very, very strong set of relations that emerged around the cinema and the CBD. Now, just very briefly, as the historian in me will want to make the point that Athlone was part of apartheid's modernization program in the age of forced removals. And if you think about the towers, and there's a resonance with the double futures, but also this notion of the double futures came to me in a discussion with Abdullah Ibrahim, who one day said to me that people on the Cape Flats always said when they were going to the movies that they were going to go see a double future rather than go see a double feature. And it's that notion of cultivating freedom in the belly of the beast, and creating a cultural sensibility that would allow one not only to oppose apartheid, but to reinvent the self, to kind of play out the kind of scale of the imaginary. And I think that what's happened in South Africa is that whole concept of where freedom existed, where the imaginary for freedom existed, where it was thriving, has been lost to us. And so I want to return in this film to asking those questions about, where do we find this? As Robbie Jansen might have wanted us to go in search of this concept, where would we go look for this idea of freedom? And I find it really enigmatically represented in the cinemas and in the work that Jason and Rashid and a whole number of others, Sylvia, were performing in the spaces of Athlone and the Kismet Cinema in particular. So I'll just pause there. I think that the film will hopefully speak to some of those themes.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to extend a very special welcome to Sylvia. Welcome, Sylvia. Thank you for joining us today. We have introduced you in your absence, and I've just told the audience that you are affectionately known as Mama Kaap because I guess it's through media, through Rashid and through Clarence Ford and others on the radio, you've become well known and well established. I wanted to, but I think just to relate to what Premesh has just said about the imposition of petty apartheid, what is striking in the film, in your story and Itumeleng's story, is this idea of moving across and in spite of apartheid's petty boundaries across. Itumeleng talks about the imagining beyond the railway line. And I wondered if you can tell us a little bit about what was happening in Langa when you were growing up and when you were, those beautiful anecdotes about learning the songs and stumbling with the words, which are so poignant in the film. Can you tell us a little bit about what the world was like for you growing up in Langa and having access to all these beautiful musicians who lived there?
Hello, everybody. Langa, I always call it a mecca of jazz. We grew up, there was music all over the place. Now, in the olden days, you will go and sing in town, maybe City Hall, but you must sing behind the curtain because you are too black to be seen. Winston Mankungu and all of them, they used to perform like that. When you come back from the gig, there are police who are standing there at the entrance who says, what's happening in the booth? When they open the booth, they see the saxophone and everything, and they say, Spieljong, and you've got to play now because they're just making you a Mickey Mouse. This place was full of soldiers in the old apartheid days, and they were watching us. You've got to light a candle in order for you to be seen that you are still alive inside the house. And the music started from Biederhout, if you know Langa, to Sandile. And they were all people who were good jazz musicians who were singing even on the corner of the streets. That's where we got music. I'm from a musical family who were rehearsing behind at the back of our home, which was a little hockey there. And I used to listen there as young as I was, listening to they were playing Ella Fitzgerald, Sarah Vaughan's and all that. And I liked Ella, and they wanted me to sing Make the Knife. Now I was trying to be nice to sing Make the Knife. And I used to sing like, oh, the sunshine, crawly ticks fill, scattered below, ooh, 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 why? I don't know what I was singing. It's only now when I listen to the lyrics, I said, no, man, I was, and they used to say, oh, lovely baby, this is nice. And now they were playing with me. We learned music from there, and jazz was really something in Langa, and it's still something that you learn a lot out of that. Even
Thank
out
you,
of
Sylvia.
all the people that were singing, we still learn from, but they're not anymore. They dumped me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mhm.
Can I move to just bring Rashid in at this point? Rashid, I'm thinking about, I guess, you know, your career as a photographer, and you were moving in circles among artists and performers in this time and documenting them. What does the film kind of bring up for you as somebody with those kinds of memories and reflections?
Well, certainly my youth. Yeah, we moved into. I'm born in Port Elizabeth, and because of the Group Bearers Act, my father and mother, we moved up to Cape Town. We seemed to be less as aggressive and at that stage, statistics was still fine, warm estate and so forth. But you know, that period of time, Athlone was very vibey. It had something like 6 clubs going. And Jason King had one of them that was the Jazz Den. I think what the Jazz Den was on weekends. I actually know him as JJ Promotions. That was his name.
Original name.
Yeah. All the
Original
posters
name.
at JJ Promotions.
That's
And
right, yeah.
And he had a soul workshop, which was the same venue. But there was the web, there was the Athlone Hotel, there was the
Columbia 69.
Columbia 69, that's where I hung out. And then, of course, the Beverly Lounge, which is after sort of rock and roll and psychedelic music, you mature and you're upgraded to jazz, and that's the Beverly Lounge. So it sort of brought lots of memories back. And certainly the Kismet Cinema, it's been, you know, not, besides having known the owners from the daughter to the 2 brothers, it was sort of close to us in terms of movies. We all love movies. As you know, in Athlone, there was 3 movie houses. It was the Athlone Theatre, the Empire, which we used to call the Jewett, and then, of course, the Kismet Cinema. Further down, across the stadium, was the Regent Cinema, which is also one of the venues we attended. But you know, just growing up and listening and trying to recap on Athlone, this is where I cut my teeth in terms of not only music, but also being streetwise. One got to know, and this is through music actually, people like, which then people call gangsters. You know, it was Ching, Nukus, H.U. Watkine. And because I got into our music, we became sort of friends, which means that you're always safe. And it was a time that you could walk from Lawrence Road, that's where I lived, and my parents' house is still there. We used to walk up to the main road, Athlone, with no hassle, walk back any time of the night. It was always safe. So, you know, a lot of fond memories just come rolling back. The 2 record shops, for example, it was JJ that had the first one. They used to blare music out of on the pavement. And then much later, Mellotronics opened. So there was always this music in Athlone. But I could go, Velman, I can go on and on, you know, because it's
Let
like
me,
to my youth. But
yeah.
I'll give someone else a chance.
Let me pause there because I think that's you sketched a very nice picture of an emerging, a little formative emergences of an industry. And I think, I mean, to come back to Jason's point, he was trying to be quite clearly and specifically commercial and entrepreneurial. He wanted to run a business. And because that was his experience. But what strikes me about all of these places is that there's a transition from the old way of doing things, you know, the community halls, the church halls in District 6, and then the records are coming in. So through the 1960s into the 70s, with rock and roll comes records on a mass scale. So you've got this, and then the imposition of racial segregation. So Indians can't trade here. Coloreds, these places are reserved for colored business people, and so on. And Athlone is a very interesting hub for that, because you've got the old way of doing things and the new ways all blended together, and so all these clubs that emerge. And I think what is, and this is where I think Dinga maybe to ask you a little bit about listening and about the kind of distinction that one makes now between the serious jazz that Rashid was alluding to, you know, when you play psychedelic and underground and rock, and then you come to places like the Beverly where the more high-end musicians are gathering, or where in the film also Hilton talks about that kind of separation. But everything in these places is still very concentrated because of segregation, I think. Dinga, just from your point of view, as somebody who's followed the kind of the act of listening and the kind of pedagogies of jazz, what is your sense of how the music is shifting over this time period in Cape Town?
Good afternoon. I mean, the first thing is to congratulate people who were involved in the making of this documentary. Like Premesh and other people. I think this is a day of celebration. And when I watched the documentary, what was clear to me is that whatever the conditions were under apartheid, one of the big failures of that system was its inability to suppress, kill the ability of people to dream. And in many ways, what the cinemas and the movies did was somehow to facilitate, ignite imaginaries that being put in a ghetto had thought that they would sort of kill, in terms of people being unable to imagine and dream beyond the railway line. And these institutions like the Kismet, it was not just like the Kismet, it was Empire, it was the Avalon, it was on the other side, it was the Monaco, Panorama on the Elsa side. And from someone who was looking at this and growing up, viewing this in an area where, besides the Bantu administration community hall, there was this look at the other side of the railway line and the ability of people to literally walk so that they can break the boundaries, even if those are mental, so that they can have access. And this, I think, engendered a sense of cosmopolitanism in a progressive sense. And that the ethnic identity that was being imposed and the strictures that went with that were sort of being broken by these interactions. And this, the music Velmont, captured this cosmopolitanism in a big way. And I do think that when we look at that history, this ability to find actions, activities that can trigger or facilitate this ability to dream beyond the strictures is important, and that's what the documentary said to me. And I think what young people, jazz musicians, are doing at the moment is to do that. And just maybe for people, I've just landed in Gqeberha, and I was on a flight from Johannesburg, and I would say that 1/3 of the flight were young jazz musicians going to perform at the Makhanda Jazz Festival. Africa Mkhize, Mthunzi Mvubu, Siphelele Mazibuke, Mandla Mlangeni. And I think we can learn something from this, because these are young people, Sylvia, who are giving themselves to the arts in a sincere way, when sincerity is quite scarce in other sectors. But I can talk more, but let me just pause there.
Thank you, Dinga. And I mean, it is so beautiful that you encapsulated in this concept that Premesh picked up on, the imagination, this desire to imagine ourselves. And I think that's the beauty of that, the metaphor of the double future, that we've got this imaginary future even in the midst of the despair of that time. I think we mustn't forget how difficult that time was, how much damage was done. You know, I've just been reading a book about the history of the musical King Kong, and it is so indicative of what people thought they were leaving behind. You know, in the end, people left. But all these places, both those who stayed and those who went into exile, had huge difficulties, and different kinds of, I guess, qualitatively speaking. Sylvia, do you want to speak a little bit more about the musicians you met? You mentioned Zelda Benjamin, who helped you with the lyrics of a song. What was the kind of community of musicians that you met through some of these networks that you made as you started singing? You can unmute yourself. Or maybe, Sylvia, are you okay? Otherwise, shall I go to Jason and just ask him a little bit about some of those, in some of the street scenes? I was noticing that there's quite a lot of people around Athlone who still remember that time. In what ways is Athlone different? I mean, in walking then now to the time that you were describing, you know, there were shops. And so we know that there were all these shops being built in the kind of CBD district was being created. But what about the rest of Athlone? I remember Athlone as being quite, you know, many of the old Sinkhuise were still there when I was a child, and I think some of them may still be there. What was Athlone like as a neighborhood? And maybe Rashid also has a kind of recollection of the place and the kind of range of entertainment and cultural events and activities that went on there.
Are you talking to me?
Yes.
Okay. Belmont, the experience and endurance I experienced in Athlone it was the hub of entertainment on the Cape Flats. And as we know, through the archives in Cape Town, the Cape Flats expanded from Devil's Peak to Plattekloof and from Strandfontein to Bloubergstrand. That is the Cape Flats, registered in the archive. But Athlone was the hub of entertainment in the whole Cape Peninsula. And what I experienced besides the activities and the safety we had in Athlone was I experienced apartheid within apartheid. Firstly, I was an Indian promoter, a young Indian promoter that endeavored to go into the various townships and to fetch people like Christopher Columbus, who was the father of Esken Nkaka and Duke Nkaka. And I established the first big band, which I named the Phoenix Big Band, with Christopher Columbus and Mr. Bucks on piano and Nelson Magodla on drums. Max Damani was the other drummer. There was also Willie Nettie on trumpet. And Temba Metlamakola from Guguletu. I used to go and fetch these people in the townships. Some of them worked till 6 p.m. at night from wherever they came. Then they had to wash up in the inconvenience of their homes, which wasn't proper homes, no proper water supplies. And while my show was opening at 8 o'clock at the Kismet Cinema, I was on many times confronted by the Bantu administration law officials that used to follow me around wherever I went. And on so many more occasions, I was imprisoned in an office until 9 o'clock the evening, just out of sheer spite, no fine, no warnings, but just knowing that I was an Indian in a Bantu area, which was not allowed. So that was the apartheid within apartheid. I think we have some crosstalk here with Sylvia's cross-talking here.
I think, yeah, it's not muted. I don't have access to a mute button here, but
Okay.
carry on. We are listening.
So people like Winston Mankunku, who came to me at the age of 18, confronted me at the Kismet Cinema one day and asked me if you could play on the show. And that was in 1966. And I said, what do you play? He says, I play the tenor saxophone. It is at that time that I put Winston Mankunku on his first commercial stage at the Kismet in Athlone. And who did he play with? I introduced him to the four sounds: Cliffy Moses, Basil Moses, and the likes of the Oberkines on piano. Oberkines was the brother of the manager of the Obas, the Jewett bioscope in Athlone, a brilliant pianist who left us too early. There was also, Winston used to play with Tony Shoulder, and Edred Shoulder, and Richard Shoulder. It was a whole glitterati of fantastic jazz musicians, which I gave scope to at the Athlone. Then there was also people like Rebecca Malopi that came to me for the first time, Brenda Fassi that came to me for the first time. Once on the show, never saw them again because then they migrated to Johannesburg, where they went into bigger skills in the entertainment industry. People like Sylvia Ndundwelwa, I met her much, much later, singing as a member of the group The Splendors. And she can correct me if I'm wrong. The Splendors used to perform with some friends of mine, Booby Jamal, at the Kismet Cinema on some of my shows. And some of my shows played very prominently at the Kismet, and I gave vent and popularity and platforms to most of the people, going back to the Kwela kids, Robert Sitole, Josh Sitole, and Duke. And that was one of my biggest draw cards on the Kismet Cinema stage. Besides so many of the others, like Harry Peacock on guitar, they were stalwarts, they were great stars on the entertainment scene, especially on jazz. I love jazz so much that I endured the punishment of being locked away in offices while the late Tony Naidu used to compare my shows. And I would turn up at 9:15 in the evening with my musicians, with the instruments to go on stage at the Kismet. But that was the endurance race that I faced with the apartheid within apartheid. Indians were not allowed into a Bantu area after the curfew of 7 o'clock. And having picked up these musicians to come and play on the shows, many, many times they were practically ostracized for having an old passbook which was crumpled up or spoiled, damaged, or, you know, the law enforcement was so selfish and so spiteful in those days. They would even send those people back home again instead of coming to the concert, and enforce them just to turn around and get back home again. And that is part of the endurance race that I suffered to keep jazz on the platform, to keep jazz on stage, and to keep jazz alive on the Cape Flats. That was my endurance, and that was my contribution.
Thank you, Jason. Rashid's hand is up, and in fact, I was going to direct to Rashid, but Rashid, maybe speak the point that you wanted to raise, and if I have a question, I still can. I can also just say to those who are watching that you are welcome to give us a question or a comment if you have one. I see there's a comment from Jana Lombard in the chat. I'll get to that in a minute. But Rashid?
Yeah, thank you, Velman. I just wanted to add to what Jason King would say, sort of the more positive side to it, is that Athlone was very cosmopolitan. As much as the Boer tried to stop people coming in or mixing, the music brought people together, like it always has since then. So there wasn't any segregation in terms of clubs or the venues. And I think that's very important to note the role of music as played then and even now, the powerful role it has in terms of looking to where we're going to. Because I like to look at the future. You know, we know our past, but the future is very critical. Otherwise, you know, we live as a community of complainers. I just wanted to mention that. Thanks.
Thanks, and that brings us to Jana's question. Congrats, Premesh and team on the film. I'm just reading it out. As someone who grew up in Athlone, Lawrence Road, close to the 9 Doors in the 80s, 90s, there was a sense of pride. We never saw it as a ghetto. It was an amazing place to grow up. Arts, culture, music, community. How can this film be used as a resource for the youth today in Athlone? Is that a question for Premesh, perhaps? I see you had your hand up, Premesh.
I'm happy to kind of to field some response, and maybe Dinga and Sylvia and others can say something as well. Look, this is part of a larger project. My big question here was how to make sense of 1985 and the student struggles that I was involved in, and particularly that event that is so etched in the memory of so many of us, that called the Trojan Horse Massacre, and the devastation of that massacre as it reverberated through the student movement across the Western Cape, not just Athlone, across, you know, Mitchell's Plain, Bonteheuwel, the range of areas, but also how it broke the back of the student movement in that period. And I was kind of a much younger version of me was involved in that student movement. So part of the book project is to think with people in Athlone, but beyond Athlone, about where the sources of not just the imaginary or, you know, where we dreamt futures, but also where we constituted a politics of non-racialism. So that before non-racialism became a question that was about soft politics, you know, there was a very, very definitive way in which the cultural politics and the landscape of performance, of the cinema, played out scripts of non-racial possibility across the Cape Flats, across the length and breadth of South Africa, because the students who came out in 1985 came out in solidarity with those students who were living under a state of emergency in 36 magisterial districts across the country. So just to put that into perspective. The second thing is that, you know, in many ways, there's students that were interviewing me last week from Belgravia High, who were, you know, talking about the 80s and whether we succeeded in those struggles, you know, what was lost in those moments. And it's a time of serious, you know, stock taking, if you like. You know, we need to account for the problematics around education and what that moment did in respect of the kinds of futures that we had imagined in that period, of kind of future memory, if you like. But I want to say that also, you know, what JJ was raising about the apartheid within the apartheid, we have underestimated the problem of petty apartheid. This is the argument of my book. We have thought that grand apartheid was the pernicious form of apartheid. It really was terrible and truly horrendous in terms of how it affected the mobilities of people and the kind of distributions of population. But the problem of petty apartheid, despite its name, has become the intractable problem of apartheid in South Africa. And the cinemas were not only places that were, you know, used, that were sites where we imagined a different future. They were also used by the apartheid state. Itumeleng makes this point in the, you know, when he's talking about the Lollipop and Dingaka and these films that were made. They were used to kind of craft racial identities. So the cinema is a very complex space. And, you know, we forget that in the history of apartheid, images were fundamental to creating racial divides. And technology has a very, very pertinent role to play in promoting kind of ideas of race and so on. So, you know, this, you know, all the whole of the 20th century is really Verwoerd's and companies' experience and training in the use of technology to create new ideas of race. And so there's a big argument to be had here. So I'm trying to say, well, beyond the nostalgia, we're also sitting with what we inherit as the legacy of apartheid, the apartheid within apartheid, petty apartheid and its intractability in the kind of South African, in the making of the new South Africa.
Thank you, Premesh. And in a sense, Jana's question and Rashid's point about, I guess Dinga's point as well about youth, just thinking about how do we engage with these pasts now? In a sense, these films are beginning to circulate. There are new or younger generations who are hungry for this information, to engage with these issues and questions. In a sense, we are in a time where we need the past. We need something of the past so that we can learn from it. And it is a very exciting time to be kind of seeing all these new productions and new ways in which the archive is being revitalized and in a sense re-engaged with. So thank you for that. There's a point from Warwick Swinney. Quote, I thought Hilton's comments about not playing cover versions was crucial to the film, most of which dealt with the performance of cover versions. What does Jason think of this, and did he ever work with original compositions or write himself? It's an interesting dynamic. I was mentioning it in my earlier comments about the ways in which different kind of tastes are catered for in a closed or in a concentrated space like that. In a different situation, there may be markets for people who like more commercial music or others who prefer the more serious things. But in a sense, because of our situation, everything was clustered together. I was interested in that, and I guess the atmosphere how that played out with people in places like Athlone and elsewhere. Jason, you want to comment on that? You need to unmute yourself. You are still muted. The mute button should normally be on the bottom left. There we are. There we are.
My phone was turned the other way around, so okay, now I'm back here again. All right, I started my career in music as a person doing cover versions, listening to international musical programs, radio, the LM radio, Springbok radio, the local radios. There weren't many community radio stations then. And all over District 6 in those days, there were copycat singers. And the reason why we had copycat singers was international singing stars came to visit South Africa. Here in Cape Town, they got off at the harbor and they got off the planes and they performed at the Coliseum Theatre, the Alhambra Theatre, and the Cape Town City Hall. And just a few kilometers up the road was District 6, where people of color could never go and see those international singing stars on stage because of the Group Areas Act and the Apartheid Act. And yet they supported those international stars by buying their records at the various record shops at Oakie Bazaars and nice stores in Athlone, and tried to copy that identical style of that singers. And then they used to group together on various street corners. I remember that on the dusty roads of the District 6 and the cobbled streets in the shade of Table Mountain, and they created what they called copycat singers. And copycat singing in Cape Town was very, very prominent because at any one point of time, you would find a variety show at the Liberman Hall or the Star Bioscope or the British Bioscope, Cape Town's Nat King Cole, Cape Town's Elvis, Cape Town's Shirley Bassey, Cape Town's Red Hot Mama. Those were the draw cards. Those were the draw cards to the shows in District 6. So yes, we became popular copycat singers. And I've lived with that sort of medium of entertainment for many, many years. Even at this point of time, I have a company called The Great Pretenders. And the reason why we call ourselves The Great Pretenders is that we pretend to sound like the international singing stars. And a monologue on what I do on stage is I would always tell the audience, if you had to close your eyes just for 1 second, you would swear you would hear the original singing star. So yes, I say I worked with copycat singers or cover version singers ever since 1960, 61, 63, right up till today, but I never ever had a chance to work with original music. And that is a point that I'd like to make, which is unashamedly pretense and copycat and impersonations, unashamedly. And we are one of the best companies in South Africa doing these tributes of these international stars. So we are pretending.
But can I just say, I mean, you know, there is something about Winston Mankunku and the story of the Kwela kids, Robert Sitole, Josh Sitole. I mean, that's pretty much, you know, a different kind of invention, if you like. I mean, it created a platform for many musicians. I mean, Tex Kolati, for example, from Langa. Sylvia talks about so many musicians, you know, coming to the stage of Gary Hendricks and so on and so forth. So I think there was a mix of things. It's not as straightforward as kind of covers versus, you know, kind of sophisticated jazz. I mean, these were crossovers. Athlone was a crossover space, you know, and there's a crossover space. It allowed for crossover of genres as well.
Thank you,
Belmont.
Dinga? Yes, go for it.
Look, I mean, I would agree with what people are saying, but I think at looking at going forward in the future, I think it is important to look at something that sometimes people of my generation do not want to talk about, which it may not be fashionable, which I would call the hierarchies of oppression. I know people in the era of intersectionality, they don't want to talk about that. And I want to talk about Athlone from the eyes from the other side of the railway line. These are people who were moved between 58 and 1960 from Athlone, Welcome Estate, Danafontein, Crawford, Rylands, and pushed into Guguletu, where there were no facilities like those that mushroomed in Athlone. And I spent about 10 years going through Athlone almost every day, 10 years, from Nyanga to Mowbray. And a lot of people would get off in Athlone. And I was just wondering how much of the affection to Eflageni was also part of what used to be home to many generations from the other side of the township. And just to give you one sense, the people who worked these were people of my age who worked in Belleville and were working shifts. When they are off on a day, I'll get onto the bus, I'm going to work or I'm going to University of Cape Town. They get off in Athlone. The first thing they do in the morning, they put in their laundry for cleaning. And then as part of entertainment, which was something that people used to do, they wait for their laundry from 9 o'clock. They listen to cases at the magistrate court, off. That's part of entertainment, to listen to cases. And some people who didn't have any legal qualification, they start in the bus talking about cases, which they listened in Athlone. And then when they finish lunchtime, they get their fish, which is lunchtime, and they start at 2 to 5. When I come back from work on my way back home, they get into the bus back to the townships. And I think this idea of people coming back to Athlone, yes, it wasn't just a nostalgic part, but it may be a place where it used to be home, and what was now the new home didn't have all these other facilities, and people were creative in making entertainment. So a day off is spent in Athlone, from court to a movie to cleaners and to many things that didn't exist on the other side.
That's a fantastic point, Dinga, and it emphasizes the importance of this engagement with archive and with memory, because it's not easy to, in a sense, to reclaim those memories. It needs another kind of dose of imagination, and in a sense, intervention, creative intervention, to try to find different ways or different registers in which people engage with urban spaces and with the city. Thank you for that. We are running out of time, and I thought perhaps we could ask Rashid and Sylvia if they have any parting thoughts, because they've now been quiet for a few minutes. Rashid?
Thank you. I'm holding back. I can go on forever. It's been my hood for many years. But I just want to touch on what Dinga was saying, because if you look at the independent school, which is on Church Street in Athlone, the first principal was in Nyombolo, and one of my best friends, Chalmers Nyombolo, still lives in Plain Avenue. He managed to change his name to Joseph Richardson. But so, and when I said earlier on that Athlone was really cosmopolitan, JJ mentioned the drummer Max Diamond. We called him Max Diamond. Max Diamond, because he shone like a diamond playing. Also born in Athlone, and then moved to, with the whole group he was acting, moved them to Guguletu. So the point I was going to make, or I want to make, is it important that Athlone was very, very mixed. The 9 doors, where I live on the next corner, literally had a 9 doors, wooden iron place with 9 doors, 9 families, and they were all totally mixed. So, and with people coming back, they're coming back just for comfort, and they can afford it. In fact, they could afford it that time already. They weren't given the chance to make a choice of where they want to live. Thank you.
Thank you, Rashid. Sylvia, you got, would you like to say any final words? You need to unmute yourself. While we wait for Sylvia.
Hello,
Jason,
can you hear me?
oh, there you go. There you go. Yes, please. Go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted, when we were talking about Zelda Benjamin or Zelda Urin. At the it was Kismet, I think, were performing there. And now the thing was, I wanted to sing Wave. So close your eyes, so I didn't know the lyrics. So I told Zelda that, hey, I don't know the lyrics. Zelda was writing lyrics at backstage. And after that, she gave me the paper. And I sang the tune, and I knew, because I was very fresh, I could keep it in mind and do that. So that was the kind of relationship that we had. We would walk from Langa to Athlone, Rashid and them, they can come to Langa. And it was that kind of thing. Dollar Brand, they used to come here and do all sorts of things, music. All this bailam, they got it from us here in Langa. And I remember there's another club that was in Athlone when I was performing there. And there was a youngster, a white lady who was sitting at the end of the stage on the steps. When I got off, she was sobbing, crying. And I said, what's wrong? You didn't sing my song. And I said, what is your song? The click song. And I said, oh my gee. I had to turn back and go and do the click song because she wanted the click song. So it was that kind of family type of thing. Langa, Guguletu, Athlone, and everywhere. Another thing that I want to stress is the jazz is not from America. It is from, they took our people here. They made them slaves, and those people went there with our rhythms. If you listen to what I'm singing, if I do like Choni Lang, I can do Mood is Mood for Love inside like Choni Lang. So they took our rhythms. So let's not mess it up and think that we are copying them. We're not copying them. They are copying us. They must know that. So that is kind of jazz that we learned from everybody was singing. Even Winston and them, there was a guy called Bugs Gong that nobody mentions.
Congo, yeah.
That was our maestro. Bugs was our maestro. I used to call him Quincy Jones because what he used to do when we're rehearsing, he would write just notes while we're singing and give you your part and your part and your part and say, sing this. The music that comes there, the voices that comes there, the 4 freshmen, if you know 4 freshmen, you find that this guy is a real genius. So we had those kind of people that we learned from. Victor and Tony's, they were younger than those guys. Aspros Poyo, who was singing Sammy Davis like it's getting out of fashion. Donald Chomelas and all those kind of people. We
Mm.
were together, we were like a family. I wish it could come back.
Hey. Thank you, Sylvia. And we just have a word from the organizers that we have a few more minutes, so we don't have to cut it off so radically. So I'm going to read some comments from the audience. From Velma Pfaff. Thank you for all the reminiscing and talking story. I grew up in Kensington, where my uncle John Pfaff was blessed to teach Abdullah to play the piano. The double futures fill us with joy at remembering our musical and artistic journeys and revisioning our futures in the fullness of the present. Thank you. And from Ben Verghese, hi everyone. Might the panelists consider discussing Samad Center, Joseph Stone, in the mix of African live music venues, especially by the 80s? Did the politics or use of these sites distance them and audiences from the map of venues named so far? Interesting question. Anybody want to jump at that one? Rashid, Dinga, or
Can I
Premesh?
say something about the Samaj? I mean, by the 80s, you know, the student movement used the Samaj Center. In fact, the first rally that became the formation of the Athlone Student Action Committee, which was also then closely tied to joint SRCs, which was a kind of Lagunya Crow, you know, network of SRCs. We used Athlone, the Samaj Center, but that was also where the Gumbas happened with Sakile, Bayete.
Yes, I remember very well. Yeah.
In Cape Town. I mean, so there were both spaces of rallies and there were spaces of, you know, of kind of music. So there were other formations in Athlone. The Eon group was boycotted, as you know. I mean, you know, the schools, for example, had a very strong position because of the whole, you know, the way the Eon group had kind of been a group. It had moved from District 6 to Athlone, and it was part of a kind of compromise, a kind of colored entertainment project on behalf of the kind of colored representative council. So there were very strong boycotts. I mean, Silverley Primary School, for example, was excluded from school sports because they used the venue in the 1980s. So, but I know that it was also a space of cinema and so on. I just want to make one point. I mean, you know, I've been thinking a little bit about generations and, you know, Yana's question earlier, you know, it's an important one because, you know, I've been thinking again about Richard Reeve and the novel he wrote called Emergency Continued. And it's a book about the student struggles of 1980s. And, you know, at the heart of that book is a generational conflict. And what we inherit on the Cape Flats is the legacy of apartheid in many, many forms, as JJ was putting it. But one of them is this notion of a generational conflict, you know. So I'm trying to think, you know, with this, you know, in making this film with Blake Steenkamp and Jacob Klutish, Khalid Shamis, and this comes out of a documentary film program at the CHR at UWC, where we're trying to find ways of connecting form and content and learning. I mean, I'm not really a filmmaker. Let me just confess that I'm trying to think as an historian through a different medium and what does it mean to make histories through other media and other forms. But one of the things that came to us in our conversations was how much of the everyday we don't see when we write, you know, the kind of when we write the histories of apartheid and the experience of apartheid. And it's that notion of the everyday that we need to kind of think with. Heidi Grunebaum has done some work on this, but we need to be quite careful in how we resuture relations across generations, because that is work that we've abandoned. And I want to say that Athlone, in many ways, in talking to JJ and Sylvia and the range of people who appear in this film, what I realized is that there is a certain kind of work that we've abandoned in South Africa. And that's because, you know, the national political frame doesn't allow for this intense kind of focus on the kind of making of the everyday and how one renews one's, you know, life and perspective in thinking through the everyday. So jazz is absolutely critical. And I'll make a plug for Brother with the Perfect Timing. I mean, that scene where Abdullah is talking about Basil recalling a scene in Manenberg on a Saturday morning is the kind of modality for me of what we can possibly do through, you know, revitalizing the kind of cultural politics of communities on the Cape Flats.
Thanks, Premesh. And I come back to Dinga's point about erasure and the erasure, and I guess the opposite of erasure, the affirmation and the little nudges to what may be left behind in people's memories and how people relate to places and spaces. Those things needs a careful and considered kind of reaffirmation and recreation in a way, and that comes from the imagination, and it is the work many of you are already involved in. Rashid, with his vast archive and knowledge of the place, and yeah, those kind of careful process of reworking what is in that archive and how do we remobilize it for generations now and in the future. Are there any other questions or comments from the floor? Let me see what the Q&A. From Josette Cole. Congratulations to Premesh and all involved. And she hasn't seen the film yet. My question relates to our present and future. How does one get the political decision makers and government officials to foreground arts and culture as a pillar in the post-apartheid moment instead of treating it like a Cinderella, nationally and provincially, with minimal resourcing and not an integral part? That's a big question. I don't know if anybody wants to tackle that. Premesh?
Can I say this? I mean, by naming the apartheid of the everyday petty apartheid, Verwoerd and others were involved in an act of deception. They were trying to suggest that, this was a small Anyana problem, the question of culture. In fact, apartheid's infiltration of the psychic structure in the everyday was through this mechanism of petty apartheid. If we want to undo apartheid, we got to take this very seriously, because that is where Verwoerd, and if you want to, you can go look at his when he was a student, he did a lot of work on how to affect the senses. And his big project was to make sure that you control populations by taking hold of the senses. You control the senses. So we need to think now about how to reactivate the sensory structures to bring back the senses as part of the project of undoing apartheid and its aftermath.
Thank you, Premesh. I think I'm going to wind us down now. This has been an incredible panel. Unless any of the panelists has something more to say. I see Dinga smiling a little bit. Maybe Dinga wants to say something.
By the way, Dinga was my teacher. I should just confess that too.
He was many people's teacher. Okay, Dinga, and then
look, it's again, I think it's important to congratulate those involved in this. And I mean, I was born, grew up in Cape Town, and there is a lot of work to be done in what I see as a retreat from non-racialism, however skin deep that may have been, a proliferation of what I call segregated activism. And I think it's projects like these that can help us move forward without the nostalgia. And when I put that out, I'm going to be on this panel on Facebook. A lot of people spoke about their walk from Gugule to down Klipfontein Road, and what they met on their way to Kismet and Athlone. And remember, Valmont, there are people when there was forced removals who decided that they're going to change and take what is called an ID and to remain in these areas.
Yeah.
And for them to assert that they were not from Gugule, Olanga, or Nyanga, they had to be vicious on Klipfontein Road. And I think those damages where people had to pretend not to know the language that was being spoken so that they could survive. These are some of the things that as part of a building anew and the healing, we need to take the injury that was there.
Absolutely, and it's a politics of remembrance as well. I remember there were musicians like Donald Chomela who always make this point. We remember District 6, but we don't remember the Milky. We used to. He was being very pointed about the politics of remembrance. That it is something that you need to be working on beyond the nostalgia of the recall of a place. So thank you for that. Jason,
I
you
think-
wanted to say something?
I've got it.
Go for it.
What I need to say as we wind down this program, Belmont, is that Premesh was referring earlier about the generation of the 80s of the school students, the uprising of the students fighting the regime of apartheid. And there was one person in particular that helped the student generation to really get the word out there, because in those days, there was no social media, Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. And the word had to get out there for people to go to the Samad Center, the Kismet, and the City 400 bioscopes for meetings. And fortunately, we had a person who's endured lots of bad treatment to the authorities at Victor Verster. It was my brother-in-law, Ali Parker, who had a printing company, Ali's Press. And he sacrificed just about everything he had to support the apartheid system in those days. Not support the apartheid system, but to support the students' uprising of against the apartheid system. I think my battery is running low on my phone, so I'm going to be dying out shortly. But that's a point I wanted to have made, that an icon like Ali Parker should always be remembered on the K-flat scene, where he kept politics alive and he kept the students' uprising alive and the fight against apartheid. Whichever medium it was, whether it was music or arts and culture, whatever, Ali Parker was the man that kept things alive at no cost at all to any of the student worlds. And he spent 3 seasons in Victor Verster. Premesh, he remembers you very clearly, and Valmont, he remembers you as well. Ali Parker.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jason. And I think I'm going to read the last few comments. Premesh wanted to say something, and then I'll close after that.
No,
Premesh,
I've spoken enough.
Okay.
I've spoken enough.
This has been such a fantastic panel, but let me just read a few more comments from Bevel Lucas. Wow, thanks very much. I'm taking my granddaughter to the movies tomorrow. I still remember Oswiti Drive and the others. Thank you, Leanne, for your comments. Lauren Platsky says, thanks for the memories. I remember of many of these people and places with great warmth. Jacob Kluti, the senses have been captured by technology and the media. So it is scary to hear that they are still captured by petty apartheid. Thank you so much to all the panelists, to Rashid Lombard, Premesh Lalu, Jason King, Dinga Sekwebu, Sylvia Mamakap, Dunyelwa. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the questions and comments from the audience. And of course, to the Encounters Film Festival. Please do go out and support the festival and the films, and especially, of course, this film. It has been a fantastic conversation, and yeah, go well. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Belmont.
Thank you so much. Okay.
Thank
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye,
you.
Premesh. See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care.